and welcome to Novelty Show, Episode 0. Who are we?
I'm Alexa.
I'm Lainey.
And I'm Kat. And this is the introduction episode to a new podcast all about writing and publishing. So let's get started with why we are starting this podcast.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, the three of us are all YouTubers. Specifically, we're part of the AuthorTube community. We are authors on YouTube and we make videos about writing. And Novelty Show started, and still is, a bi-weekly live show. We alternate hosting on our different channels, and we talk about topics in the publishing industry and writing craft. And we got an overwhelming response from our watchers that they really wanted a podcast version.
And we've all been interested in starting a podcast for a while. So this just seemed like a great fit for all of us to get together and do this.
We also have a Patreon to help fund this podcast, where patrons can suggest topics, vote in polls, and ask us questions. Our live show and podcast will always be free, but if you want to support us, you can check us out at patreon.com/noveltyshow.
And now let's talk a little bit about who we are, what our history is with writing and publishing, and why you want to listen to us. I am Alexa Dunn. I am a traditionally published young adult fiction author. My debut novel, Brightly Burning, is Jane Eyre in space, and it was published in May of 2018 by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. I have a second book coming out in February 2020. It is a companion novel to my first one. It is called The Stars We Steal, and it is Jane Austen meets The Bachelor, ... in space. There's a theme. And I have been writing towards publication, my long story. I first said I'm going to write a novel in 2008. I did not finish a novel until 2013, early 2013. Though I'd say I started very seriously writing towards publication and researching the industry in 2010 or 2011. I joined Writer, kind of the online writer space. I followed a lot of blogs, like Miss Snark's First Victim. And I got into once I'd finished my novel, I did some of the contest stuff. I was in Pitch Madness. I was also in The Writer's Voice. And I did end up finding my first agent through one of those contests. And I like to say that it took me 4 years, 3 books, 2 agents to get a book on bookshelves. From the first time that I finished a novel to the time that my book was on shelves was 5 years, but 4 years until I got a book deal. It was my third book. I left my first agent. I queried my second book, and it failed abysmally. I think that was the world getting back at me for getting an agent on my first book, like basically saying, ha ha ha, you thought you were great, you were not. But then this really pushed me to write my third book, which became my debut. I got another agent, and it then took, from the time I signed with my second agent, it was about a year until I sold it. And then my book was crashed, which means it was rushed to publication. It was on shelves 13 months later, so 2018 was my debut year. The month after I got my book deal, I started my YouTube channel, which is how I ended up becoming friends with Kat and Lainey, how we discovered each other. So I started my AuthorTube channel in June of 2017, and now as of late February, early March 2019, I am at 25,000 subscribers. And I always love to give advice and talk about the industry and share my experiences, and YouTube gave me that avenue. And now there's a podcast. I've always really loved giving advice and helping people, helping my friends mostly, because I've learned a lot about kind of agents and red flags to look for, what makes a good agent, good versus bad publishers. And so in late 2016, with my critique partner, I started Author Mentor Match. It is an author mentoring program. We pair YA and middle grade authors who have good agents and or have book deals or multiple books out with aspiring writers who've completed a manuscript, a young adult or middle grade manuscript, but they don't know what to do next. They need help with editing it, with querying. They want advice from a professional, from a mentor, to help them get their footing in the publishing industry. It's really something I'm passionate about, which is one of the many reasons I was really excited to start Novelty Show with Kat and Lainey and now do this podcast, because there are so many topics that we can explore more in depth in a podcast format that just isn't possible on any of our YouTube channels or in the live show format. So I'm really excited to dive in and get started.
So hi, my name is Kat O'Keefe, and I have been writing for a while. Like Alexa, it was around 2008, 2009 when I really started taking writing seriously. That's when I discovered NaNoWriMo and aspiring author blogs and agent blogs. I started my own blog to chronicle my journey, and I wrote and queried a book a year for about the first 3 years. All of those books were ultimately rejected, but I did come quite close with the third book, and I had really believed in that one, so that rejection hit me pretty hard. When I started writing my fourth book, I also started my YouTube channel. It was 2011, Halloween, and I decided I was going to do NaNoWriMo and film daily vlogs of my writing month. For those of you who don't know, NaNoWriMo stands for National Novel Writing Month. It's an annual event where writers from all over the world attempt to write 50,000 words of a rough draft in the 30 days of November. My YouTube channel did not take off that year. By the end of the month, I had like 28 videos because I missed a couple days, and I did win. I had 50,000 words of a new book, and I had about 40 subscribers at that point. But then I did it again in 2012, and that's around the time that BookTube really started gaining some traction, and some of the BookTube audience found my channel, and I started to grow, and I started to expand my content into a more BookTube direction. My channel starting to take off, along with the sting of rejection still affecting me, had me shifting my priorities a little bit. I always loved writing and knew that I would pursue publication again. Like, it wasn't off the table completely, but I was happy to take a break from pursuing publication and just focus on YouTube and improving my craft for a couple of years. I still did NaNoWriMo almost every year. I just haven't queried anything since 2010. I do now have 4 trunked novels that had been revised but aren't good enough to be published. And then I have another 5 viable projects that some are still in NaNoWriMo draft form, but some are mid-revision. And now, in 2019, I am diving back into the publishing game. Though not quite yet, I'm still working on revisions for this project, but I will hopefully be querying later this year. I started drafting this project in September of 2018, so I've been working on it for about 6 months now, and I love it, and I hope I can make it good enough to pursue publication. Because even though I took a break from pursuing publication, I love this industry and I love talking about it, which is another reason I'm so excited for this podcast and getting to talk about the ins and outs of writing and the industry with Alexa and Lainey here.
Hi, my name is Lainey Kress, and I also have a AuthorTube channel. My publication history, I feel like, starts back in middle school when I was super involved in the Sims fandom and the Neopets fandom, where I discovered my love for storytelling and writing on both those platforms. And in high school and some in college, I role-played a lot on online forums. And as college happens, I really fell out of love with both reading and writing as I got really busy pursuing my degree. And my senior year of college is when I discovered BookTube, where people talked about books online on YouTube. And I thought that is something I can totally do. So I started my BookTube channel in 2015, and I talked a lot about books, and I started transitioning a little bit into my writing videos during NaNoWriMo and Camp NaNoWriMo. My first completed novel, I started in NaNoWriMo of 2014, and I finished it to what I thought was complete in the beginning of 2016, which is when I first started to query it. I am very thankful that I did not get published with that book. In retrospect, I'm glad it never went anywhere, but I needed that experience of querying to fuel my desire to get published by a book that I really loved. Since then, I have been writing about a book a year, and I have not queried in earnest since that first round of querying in 2016. But I have been very active in Twitter, on the Twitter online community, especially during contest season. I tried for Pitch Wars in 2017, and I did not get selected, but I got a lot of great feedback from mentors who had requested my work. And the rejection of Pitch Wars actually fueled my need to write a really good book. So that year for NaNoWriMo, I wrote my current work in progress, which is a YA fantasy, and I eventually got into Author Mentor Match round 5 with that completed manuscript. I am currently working on revisions for that book, and I also have 2 more active projects that I'm working on, both YA fantasies, but my first novel has definitely been shelved forever.
So essentially, we're all YA writers. We specialize in young adult fiction. I'd say, do any of us have aspirations to write outside of YA? ?
I do have some ideas for adult novels, but they're really in that gray area between YA and adult that publishing tends to classify as either one or the other. I do have a couple ideas that I would say have crossover appeal. Like they might technically be adult fantasy, but they're adult fantasy with characters in their early 20s that are still figuring out their place in the world and still have like a young adult feel.
And I'd say we probably want to do a whole episode on marketing categories, how it works in traditional publishing versus self-publishing, and kind of how to strategize and career plan around that. Because I feel like a lot of us have work that does fall into the no man's land of they're not quite teens, but it feels like a YA novel, except it's kind of adult, but is it? ? And we can talk about imprints like Wednesday Books, which is actively publishing those crossover books, but this is a great sample of some of the things that we want to talk about.
Yeah. And again, there's also that line between traditional publishing and self-publishing, because in self-publishing, they don't have such restrictions of like, well, if there's a 20-year-old protagonist, we can't call it YA, whereas traditional publishing does tend to have that mentality.
Well, and we'll definitely be doing episodes that cover that. Well, the expertise the three of us have that Novelty Show will focus on is traditional publishing and YA, because that's what we're all doing. I think we're all interested in hybrid publishing as well. Getting a base and a start in traditional publishing and then exploring indie options for other projects. I certainly do. So my kind of long game plan is someday I'm going to write adult romance, because I think of myself primarily as a romance writer. My YA is very frothy and kind of soap opera. I love romance because my first book retold Jane Eyre, and my second one is essentially Jane Austen's Persuasion. I love feelings books. But I also see myself writing adult thrillers now that I'm writing a YA thriller, which is my current whip. My primary reading for pleasure genre is adult thrillers. I devour them like candy, so that's definitely something I'd be interested in. And as we explore these other areas, we'll figure them out on the podcast as well, which is exciting. And what about you, Lainey?
Before I started writing YA solely, since 2014, I actually wrote adult on the online forums that I wrote with other people. And that was a lot of fun for me to kind of explore, because it was a lot of crime and thriller aspects, I guess, as well. And one of my long-term projects in college was an adult thriller. But I don't think it's really good anymore, but it would be fun to revisit that because I still really love the premise of it. But I see myself as a YA writer because YA, as I remember it when I was a teenager, is a lot different than YA now. However, I still want to... Those are the books that made me realize I love to read. And I kind of want to be that author to another person who is 12, 13, 14, 15 plus that falls in love with reading because of my books.
Same.
But I also I also would like to write adult romance because
Yay, squad.
Because I read probably the most adult romance than I do YA, but I just love adult romance so much.
Yeah, and something that I'd like to speak to, what another reason we are starting this podcast and why we've decided we're the right people to do it, because why not? YA as a category is really saturated. It is harder than ever to break into YA, and I think there are a lot of misconceptions based on the Twilight era that, oh, it's easy to write a YA book and it's easy to get an agent and it's super easy to get a $500,000 book deal, because those are the things that we hear about a lot. And, everyone derisively talks about like Twilight or the Hunger Games, but the landscape has really, really changed, and a lot of advice out there is out of date. Essentially, the what you need to make it now, the books that you have to write, the level you have to get to, and the strategy you have to employ to get agented and then sell a book and then keep selling books, it's harder. And so I bring the perspective of, I'm kind of like, I've got one foot in it. I basically have my first book contract there. And my next step is, how the heck do I stay writing YA? And then you guys, you're in it right now. You're in the trenches. And we're going to kind of explore all facets of what it really takes to do this.
Yeah, especially what you're saying about just how much the industry has changed over the last 10 years. A huge thing is social media and how big of a player that has become in the publishing industry. When Twilight first sold and first came out, Twitter wasn't really a thing, and it very much is now. Also, the self-publishing industry has changed dramatically in the last few years, and it's gone from, self-publishing wasn't a thing that many authors took seriously, and now self-publishing is absolutely a viable publishing avenue. Like, some of the most best-selling authors right now are self-published romance writers.
Absolutely. And so, we hope to kind of explore all facets of that, but particularly offer practical tips and tricks and tools for traditional publishing and young adult fiction. So I think it's very important to pose this question to all of us. I think listeners will want to know, and that is, plotter or pantser?
Ooh.
Because if we're going to talk, we will definitely do episodes that are very craft-focused and craft-based and process-based. And there are some points of contention among us in terms of how to write a book. But thus you'll get all perspectives.
Yeah.
Kat!
I am a plotter. I am a hardcore plotter. I love plotting. I actually, during my sort of break from pursuing publication, where I decided to focus on my writing craft, I decided to develop an outlining method. So I studied 3-act structure, and I broke it down into a 9-block, 27-point method that I now use to outline just about every book I write, everything I write. And I completely stand by that, even though I know it does sound very intense, a 27-point outline.
It terrifies me. Thank you. But I do, people use your method. Your method has, spread like wildfire.
Yeah, I've been finding that out lately. I've had I found out from a couple of published authors that they used my method, and I was just like, oh, well, thank goodness it actually works, because I'm not published yet, so I don't have the proof, but at least there are other authors who have used my method and who have gotten published. It works.
What about you, Lainey?
Well, I'm not as intense as Kat is with plotting, but I do consider myself a plotter. But I kind of straddle the line between plotting and pantsing to some extent, but I don't consider myself a pantser at all. But I'm definitely more of a plotter. I need at least an act outlined before I start writing it. And I tend to do that where I'll write the first act, and then after I finish the first act, I'll outline the second act, and then I'll write it. And then after I finish writing the second act, I'll kind of regroup again, figure out what my outline for the final act will be, and then I'll write that.
So I am the shameless pantser of the group. Though the beautiful thing about pantsing is a spectrum. I think plotting's a spectrum as well, but I think the spectrum matters a bit more in pantsing because it's either complete chaos or organized chaos. And I am organized chaos. So we're not, like, I feel like we overlap in some places. I still find your outlining method daunting and I want to cry. But, I'm kind of like you, Lainey. I do kind of have to know something going in. But I'm not going to outline a whole act. Like, don't try that with me. I will cry. Although we'll talk about the process of my attempting to outline and write my current project. But generally, my style is, I need an inciting incident. I need a midpoint turn. And I need, like, a character arc. Like, I need to know where my main character is starting and ending, usually the romance. Like, I know what the romance needs to do, but then I love flying by the seat of my pants. I love sitting down to write and not knowing what the heck I'm gonna do, but know that I know where it last left off, and I kind of, as I sit down, go, well, what happens next? And then I just make it up. I'm really energized by that writing process. Though I have learned to refine it a little because the flip of it is you have to edit more. I happen to love revision. I think we're all pro revision people though. This isn't a podcast where we're gonna like cry about editing. We all enjoy it. So we can. Oh no, Lainey. Oh no.
I mean,
do you not like editing?
I'm not gung ho about it, but I know it's necessary.
Oh God, I love it. I love it so much. Well, we'll definitely do an episode on editing. Or more than one.
I mean, I wouldn't say, like, my favorite aspect of writing is definitely the outlining and the drafting.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
I like the drafting, too.
And revising is not my favorite, but I do also really like it because it's where I feel like I get the most work done.
Yeah.
You know, like my drafts especially, even though I outline, my first drafts are more of a draft zero. My outline, like I almost feel like I pants my outline and my zero draft because I do it so quickly. And then it's over the next few months that I really sit down and revise. And I usually double my word count from my original draft because it's so like, because my original draft is so sparse and chaotic and messy. Even though I've outlined it, it's just like general story beats. So yeah, revising is where I fix everything. It's the hardest part, but once I have like a revised section, I feel the best about that. Like I love having revised sections.
Yeah, I adore revision. It's my favorite. It's so funny because I also think of myself as having messy drafts, but they're pretty complete. I do typically write slower, even though like I'm pantsing, but it is slower because I have to ruminate kind of between writing sessions. My drafts are pretty clean, but they lack layers. That's usually how mine are messy. Like they're missing things because I have this awful habit of getting to the 60% mark of a novel right before the third act, figuring out something big I need in act 3, and then having to rewrite acts 1 and 2 significantly because I came up with something so cool, it changes the DNA of the book. But I enjoy that because there's something wrong with me. JK.
And now let's talk a little bit about our current projects. What is the number one, or maybe if you have 2 projects right now that you are working on and will be working on for the beginning section of our podcast?
So I am currently working on revisions of my YA fantasy. It is pitched as Pirates of the Caribbean meets Kylo Ren, and it has to do with pirates and witches. And I'm also currently drafting another YA fantasy, and that one is a little bit like the Borgia family meets Cruel Intentions. So there's a lot of religious politics and bets going on, and interesting romantic relationships.
Interesting. You don't see the quotes, listeners. Interesting.
Alexa, what are you working on?
So I am currently in a bit of a writing experiment. I am experimenting with outlining, which I know, shocking. I've been documenting this on my YouTube channel because I am writing a YA thriller, which genre-wise is very different from my first two books that are out or being published, which were our YA sci-fi retellings. But I just adore thrillers, and I came up with an idea. It's basically, I'm not saying too much about it, but it's like Gossip Girl, Mean Girls with competitive college admissions and murder, obviously. But thriller has a baked-in structure, and there are beats that you really have to follow, and you cannot reasonably pants a thriller, in my opinion. I'm sure someone disagrees with me, but I don't think you can reasonably pants a thriller without knowing your ending. So I started with my ending. I started with my motive and my killer, and I worked backwards. So I did significantly outline a first and a third act with a big, giant, nebulous second act. I've discovered this is why I'm a pantser. I cannot outline second acts. But I'm also currently challenging myself to fast draft. So I started it at the end of January, and I have almost to 40K, which for me is fast for writing a book. That I'm very close to the break into 3, so I'm almost 2/3 done, and it's been 6 weeks. That's huge for me. And my aim is to finish it in March and revise it as quickly as possible, because I love quick, clean, intense revisions. I like to whip a book into shape.
And I am currently working on revisions right now. Like I mentioned earlier, I started drafting this project in September of 2018, and I started drafting it kind of how Alexa is fast drafting and kind of outlining. My draft of this was kind of pantsing it. Like I came up with the idea for it, and 2 days later I started writing it. So my outline was very minimal, and I fast drafted it and got the first draft done. And now I am working on revisions. It is a YA... genres are really weird with this book. It's YA. A significant portion of it is set at a boarding school, and there are definitely fantastical sci-fi elements going on. And it's very hard to pitch this book without getting into more specifics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my other main project, which is what I was working on back last fall and realized I needed to take a break from it, and that's why I started this new project. So my other ongoing project is called Storyteller. It is a book that I originally drafted in NaNoWriMo 2012 when my channel was first getting started, and that is a YA fantasy about an aspiring author who is working on a high fantasy novel, and she falls asleep at her desk and wakes up in the novel. And her characters start going off plot. They're not talking to the right people. Her outline is falling apart. They're ruining everything. So she has to intervene and help guide her characters through the story from the inside. And that project is currently on hold right now because I realized I needed to do a major rewrite. So I will hopefully be tackling that rewrite later this year after I finish this revision on this other project.
And I think to wrap up, we should cover the most important question of all time, which is, what are our Hogwarts houses?
So this is funny because we're all kind of the same.
This is why we're friends.
Well, I'm Pottermore sorted as a Ravenclaw, which I've always identified with. But I also have Slytherin tendencies. But I firmly believe I am a Ravenclaw.
So, hard same. Though, one of the reasons I know I'm a Ravenclaw is I have intense, ranty feelings about Pottermore that I won't get into here except to say that there is literally no way that the current Pottermore quiz is scientifically accurate. It's definitely random because I am not a Gryffindor. I'd sooner be a Hufflepuff than a Gryffindor. I am a Ravenclaw. 11-year-old me would have been sorted into a Ravenclaw. I have the intensity of a Ravenclaw. But every single day that I am in publishing, I become more and more Slytherin. So I have been self-identifying as a Slytherclaw for a good 4 years. And I think it's the perfect combination. I think Slytherclaws were bookish, but we're ambitious. So, boom.
Yeah. I think it's the best hybrid house.
Yes! Slytherclaws get shit done.
They do.
Yeah.
With less underhandedness, because we're so into, like, kind of rules and, like, doing things, like, because there's that Ravenclawness of, like, rule following.
And yeah, I also am a Slytherclaw. I do tend to lean more into the Slytherin side of things, but mostly just because I like that aesthetic. Because I do very much relate to Ravenclaw. Like, I love, like, research and, you know, I developed a 27-point outlining method. Like, that's really Ravenclaw. Yeah. I do still have, like, Slytherin ambition, but I don't think it's the main thing that drives me, because I was able to kind of take a step back from pursuing publication for a while and focus on my craft. And I feel like that was the Ravenclaw jumping out. But yeah, Slytherclaw for life.
Yes. I think generally none of us advocate publishing at any cost. We all believe in taking your time, doing the work, and being not just published, but published well, which is something that we're going to cover a lot.
Yeah, it took me a while to come to that realization, too, because I was, there was a couple years there where I was trying to rush it, and now, in 2019, I'm like, you know what? Just take your time. It'll be more worth it if you take your time.
Oh, yeah. Same here.
So I think that's it for this, which we consider episode 0. We'll be posting the first full episode of Novelty Show podcast shortly, and Patreon has decided, we put up a poll, and our first episode is going to be, how the heck do you write a book anyway? So we're going to hear more about that 27-point outline.
Oh boy.
So no, we're going full one-on-one. We're really going to dig into how do you even write a book, because I think the hardest thing about publishing and novels is finishing your first book. It is the highest hurdle you will ever face. So I'm excited to dig into that.
Yeah, should be a good one.
And if you're listening to this far in the future, hi, hello. Hope you like the show. Hope we're great.
All right, that is going to do it for this episode today. Again, thank you to all our patrons. You can check out our page at patreon.com/noveltyshow if you're interested in supporting us. We broadcast live shows every other week on YouTube, and we also have a Twitter account at Novelty Show where you can follow us for updates. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes and Google Play. It helps bump us up in the ratings and makes it easier for new listeners to find us. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, happy writing.